In this module, we're discussing the president and his powers. The presidency was relegated to Article 2 of the Constitution. The framers clearly thought that Congress, which was in Article 1, was the more important branch of government. The president must be born either in the United States or be a citizen of the United States and must be at least 35 years of age and must take the oath of office as prescribed in the Constitution. Opponents of Barack Obama, for example, claimed that he had not been born in the United States and therefore could not be president. He is indeed a citizen of the United States, born here and was president for 8 years. As discussed in Module 5, the framers of the Constitution were fearful that the chief executive would wield too much power. Having just extricated themselves from one monarch, they did not want to create something similar in the fledgling democracy. But one reason the Articles of Confederation were replaced was because there was no executive or judicial branches. The Articles of Confederation just had one branch, the legislative branch. In Great Britain, the monarch is the head of state, but the prime minister is the chief executive. In the US, which is a republic, the president fulfills both positions. He has both the ceremonial and the political roles as figurehead and as head of state. Originally, the president was the candidate that received the most votes in the Electoral College, and the vice president was the candidate that received the second most number of votes. This was changed by the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1804, to ensure that the president and the vice president were of the same party affiliation. The principal source of the president's political influence is their constitutional authority to execute public policies. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution states that the president is also commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So the commander-in-chief is a citizen. He also has the power to grant pardons for offenses against the United States, except in the cases of impeachment. During President Barack Obama's final months in office, he granted a record number of pardons. Many of those pardons were of inmates imprisoned for nonviolent drug offenses. On Thanksgiving, the president even traditionally pardons a turkey. Part of the president's power to conduct foreign policy includes receiving foreign ambassadors. The president can also recognize foreign governments, for example. President Harry Truman made the US the second country to recognize Israel in 1948. Britain was the first country to recognize Israel. And the president can also treat with foreign governments. According to the Constitution, the president has the power to negotiate treaties with foreign countries only with the advice and consent of the Senate. President George Washington set the precedent that only the Senate's consent was needed, though presidents generally hesitate to make them without a majority of the Senate's support. One exception to this was Woodrow Wilson's negotiation of America's participation in the League of Nations at the conclusion of World War I. He failed to get the necessary 2/3 support, and so it failed. A more recent exception is Bill Clinton's 1999 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, a treaty that would have ended nuclear tests. It too failed to pass the Senate. Congress has also allowed the president executive agreements with foreign powers. As long as important matters remain the subject of treaties to be passed by the Senate, then executive orders are also a way for presidents to circumvent Congress. These orders have the rule of law if the courts do not overturn them. Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 9022 relocated Japanese Americans to internment camps during World War II. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of this executive order in the 1944 Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the United States. President Truman desegregated the military shortly after the war, for example, also by executive order. Presidents have the power to veto acts of Congress. The president's veto power is discussed in more detail in Module 5.3. Presidents can also invoke something called executive privilege. This is a way of withholding information from Congress, from the judiciary, and from the public. Signing statements are used by presidents to express how they intend to execute the bill they are signing into law. Although this was first developed in the 1800s, President George W. Bush used them more than any of his predecessors, about 800 times. And he usually used this to express his negative opinion of certain parts of a law. The president exercises his power of appointments to choose the cabinet. Cabinet members preside over federal agencies and provide key advice. The variety of expertise is supposed to discourage groupthink. This is a term meaning that people close to the president, the decision maker, go along with the consensus of the group without a deep analysis of the issue, that they are afraid to deviate from the opinion of the majority and tell the president something he may not want to hear. The head of the Office of Management and Budget, as well as U.S. Ambassador to the UN, are both cabinet members. In addition to the cabinet, the president has personnel that comprise the executive office of the president to help him discharge his powers and his duties of the Oval Office. The Oval Office, of course, is his workspace in the White House. Many of these staff members work in the West Wing or in the old executive office building. I interned in the latter. The president also has the power to appoint ambassadors and appoint federal judges. Cabinet members, ambassadors, and federal judges are all subject to confirmation by the Senate. Usually the president's selections are approved, but this is not always the case, and sometimes they're more controversial. In Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, the president is charged with, quote, taking care that the laws be faithfully executed and can only be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Of course, the president must vacate the office when his term is up. The Constitution states that the president will serve for a term of 4 years. George Washington set the precedent that the president would only serve 2 terms of 4 years each, totaling 8 years in the Oval Office. But it was not expressly written into the Constitution. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would break this precedent in 1940 and again in 1944, when he won a 3rd and a 4th term in office, respectively. America was in the midst of World War II, and the public was persuaded not to switch horses midstream, as the saying goes. After President Truman succeeded to the presidency due to the sudden death of FDR of cerebral hemorrhage on April 12, 1945, and then he won election in his own right in the presidential election of 1948, Republicans were tired of a Democrat in the executive office. They passed the 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, that put a limit of 2 terms on the president. It also stated that any person who had served out more than 2 years of his predecessor's term could not run for more than 1 term. And it stated that it did not apply to the president currently in office at the time of ratification, which was Truman. Although an amendment to the Constitution does not need the president's signature to become law, it becomes law when 3/4 of the states ratify it. So upon ratification of the 38th state, and it would not have been passed by Truman's party, the Democrats in Congress at that time, without this last provision written into it. Truman decided not to run for re-election in 1952 anyway, and this was in part for personal reasons. The First Lady, Bess, spent quite a bit of time in Independence, Missouri with her daughter, where they were from, and she really didn't want him to run. And this was also in part because the Korean War, which was dragging on at the time, was unpopular. Truman, after consulting the Joint Chiefs of Staff, fired General MacArthur, and General MacArthur was so popular that he came home to a ticker tape parade in New York City. Be sure to review this video as many times as is necessary and do your readings and look closely at the questions.